Welcome everyone to this call of the UK chapter of the Internet Society. Today, well, first, my name is Olivier Crépin-Leblond. I'm the chair of the chapter. There are a number of other members of the leadership team joining us today on this call, but we also have a set of esteemed panelists for this really interesting discussion, this roundtable on well, a big problem that we have on our heads today, which is the UK Online Safety Bill, this thing that has landed on our desks on the 12th of May. Of course, it was in production way before that. It was coming for quite some time. And today what we're going to try and do is to first have a look at the bill itself, the proposed bill itself. And Heather Burns from the Open Rights Group has very kindly proposed that she can take us through a presentation that will provide us with the background and with the perspective of what this really means for people in the UK. And then we have panelists, including Sir Richard Allen, Lord Richard Allen, sorry, who has published a very interesting blog posting on this bill. The link is in the agenda, so if you want, you can read through this as we go along. A very interesting blog post also on the consequences of this bill. Then we have Robin Wilton from the Internet Society. The Internet Society has recently drafted or published, I guess, a statement which will be which will be published in a few days' time in the House magazine, I understand. So anyway, he'll be able to take us through that, and it will be focusing on encryption, a specific part of the bill, and why encryption is important, and encryption saves lives. And then we'll have Chris Yapp also participating as a panelist here. Chris has been sort of an industry observer and an actor for many, many years. He has been a member of the Internet Society for as long as I remember, but he's also got an extensive experience in public policy, including some of his work in the past for Microsoft. And so it will be interesting to see his perspective. Now, the important thing about this webinar and roundtable is that everyone on this call is asked to contribute. So we'll start with a presentation and then with the panelists, and immediately after that, we'll open the floor for a full discussion. I gather that by now, hopefully, you all know how to use Zoom. What we'll do is to have everyone muted and I'll ask everyone to mute themselves until we open the floor. Then you can put your hand up. Putting your hand up, it will be possible at that point for me to see and to just ask for you to take the floor. You can also ask questions or make comments in the chat if you're unable to speak wherever you are. And hopefully we'll have a good, interesting discussion. The terms of engagement, of course, are, please be civil to each other. I can't expect that we're not going to be civil. Such a nice group of people, and let's see. And that's basically it. Then we'll try and see if we can come up with some next steps after that. So I don't want to waste your time on this. Let's get right down to the bill, and let's go for the brief presentation by Heather Burns from the Open Rights Group. And I'll stop sharing so she can start sharing on her side. Okay. And first, thank you so much, Heather, for jumping into this so quickly. It was very last minute that we managed to get hold of you, so it's really appreciated.
That can be fun.
Enjoy. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Olivier. I'm going to take about 15 minutes to run you through some of the concerns that Open Rights Group and the Internet Society have about what we foresee as some of the technical implications of the Online Safety Bill. For those of you who aren't familiar with who we are, Open Rights Group is the UK's largest grassroots digital rights campaigning organization. We are funded by foundations and grants and corporate support, and the very enthusiastic help of over 3,000 paying supporters and members. We've been doing this for actually 16 years now. I need to update that slide. My own areas of focus as policy manager include online privacy, online freedom of expression, and online surveillance, both by private companies and by governments. And as you're aware by now, the Online Safety Bill includes all three of those things. We also work quite closely with the Internet Society on any UK-based legislative and regulatory issues which could impact the Internet architecture at the application service layer. And suffice to say, ever since the green paper and the white paper were released 2-3 years ago, there have been a number of concerns over the course of the life of the online harms framework, which have certainly raised a lot of red flags for us. And as Olivier said, when the draft bill was finally released on the 12th of May, we were not disappointed. And everything we said was the sort of what ifs that could have been there absolutely were there. So we're now moving past the sort of what if phase of the green and white papers into what the online safety bill in draft form, which is not final, it's not law, it's given us something to work with. But this is what we need to be aware of on the Internet architecture and technical layer. So you know that the stated goal of the online harms framework, the online safety bill, is to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online. And you are a knowledgeable audience. I know that there'll be very few of you listening right now for whom this is completely new territory. So it's likely that you know that the bill involves, yes, I made this chart, a number of content moderation and service design duties for any company of any size dealing with UK-based users, which offers user-to-user contact or user-generated content. And I am not going to run through all of these tables with you, but it gives you a sense of how complicated and sweeping this bill is. For any number of businesses out there, they're going to have this set of content moderation and service design duties, ranging from protecting children to democratic content. You're going to be required to carry out at least one, if not 3, risk assessments to assess your products and services for a number of both illegal and subjective harms and risks to both adults and children. It takes 2 pages. And you're also aware that your businesses and services are going to be beholden to a number of administrative duties in terms of your relationship with Ofcom, who are going to be the online harms regulator. And you're also aware that some of the aspects of this online safety bill could actually involve criminal sanctions onto you as a business owner and as a representative of your service if you get this wrong. So clearly the stakes are very high. And I'm not going to review all of this for you. You can do this on your own time. You can contact myself or the Internet Society outside this webinar. Where I want to focus is on, as I said, 3 areas of concern that we have and what the Internet Society has with this bill, which could impact technical architecture. But before we get to that, the heart of the matter is that the draft online safety bill is a sweeping change to the system of intermediary liability that we have always known. A quick overview of what we've been working with up to this date, and this slide is admittedly sort of hybrid of the American and European models. The responsibilities under the traditional intermediary liability model have been some proactive due diligence, transparency of your terms and conditions in terms of how you deal with content, a principle of respect for user freedoms, giving them the benefit of the doubt, and of course, no proactive general monitoring obligation, which we in the UK inherited from the European Union in the e-commerce directive. So our intermediary liability law came from Europe. The content within the scope of the traditional intermediary liability model covered what was obviously illegal content, which is, terrorism, child abuse material, hate speech, things like that, depending on where you are. There has been human moderation by human moderators, and in systems such as the EU's and in the United States model, there's basically Good Samaritan provisions for moderation that, you are not in trouble if you spot something. And what is in scope has been content, the things on your screen. The way that they're dealt with in terms of due process has been a push in theory, if not always in practice, for consistent treatment. The lack of a general monitoring obligation gave you conditional immunity against liability as long as you worked within what's known as a notice and action takedown regime, which is we advise you that there's something wrong with this content and we tell you why it's taken down. And where things have been sticky, there tends to have been regulation in the court system, although that tends to involve some other forms of law, such as defamation or copyright. With the online safety bill, we are shifting from a tried and true model that's lasted really the lifespan of the commercial web into an experiment, which the UK very much hopes will be a world-leading intermediary liability regime, which other countries will follow. But it doesn't work as well as it should. The responsibilities will shift to a concept known as the duty of care, which, as you're aware, is actually borrowed from health and safety. So service providers, whether it's the biggest tech giant or the smallest business, will have to take a health and safety approach to trying to prevent any sort of subjective or objective harm, which could happen to a user of their site or service on the internet. Good luck with that. The new regime leans very heavily towards wrapping under 18s in cotton wool and trying to shield them from any sort of subjective thing which might upset them, much less cause actual harm, which is, it's one thing when you're talking about a toddler, it's another thing when you're talking about a high schooler about to enter the world, who's going to be shielded from being able to build up any resilience and coping abilities, because the services they use will be obliged to shield them from that. We're moving towards a system of, service providers and companies openly being expected to police user behavior. And part of the way they're going to have to do that is through a general monitoring obligation. And this alone is a massive shift that the UK has, in all but name only, declared that it will be leaving the European Union's e-commerce directive prohibition on a general monitoring obligation, because this bill will create a general monitoring obligation for certain kinds of content, which we will get to. Within the scope of our world-leading intermediary liability regime is both illegal and legal but subjectively harmful content. Some people call it lawful but awful. What it means is that everything, even the things that I'm saying right now, become a matter of subjective opinion as to, am I hurting someone's feelings? Am I hurting someone's opinions? Am I creating risk for someone? We're moving out of content moderation by human moderators into content moderation by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and safety tech, some of which will even seek to modify our speech. So if you type something that the AI doesn't agree with, the system is moving towards being able to retype what you said without your consent. And what's in scope isn't just content, it's content, conduct, and contact. So it's not just what we say, it's what we do and who we interact with and why. And yes, there are issues with all three of those on all sites and services. The web is not what it used to be, but as we'll see, I'm not convinced that the bill gets the balance right on this. In terms of due process, the obligations you will have as a company or a service provider depend on who you are and how big you are. There's a category for what we would, I hate the phrase tech giants, but you know the ones we're talking about, the large American companies who have largely driven this bill and who this bill is about. And then there's the rest of us, which again includes all of us. There's going to be, in certain aspects of bill, an obligation for action, then notice. So rather than notice and takedown, it's going to be basically takedown and notice. We're going to have regulation by the regulator, which is Ofcom. And one of the options in their arsenal will be business disruption measures. And I'll explain what that is a little bit later. Now, I'm going to go into the three areas, the technical areas that concern us within this draft bill. And the first one is private messaging. You've heard a lot about this bill's implications for encryption. I'm going to put that within the envelope of private messaging. We know, and Robin will talk about this at length when it's his turn up, we know that the prohibition of end-to-end encryption and the criminalization of its use is a singular goal of this government. And we have seen recent messaging strategies by government which have openly sought to associate end-to-end encryption with the actual promotion and encouragement of child abuse. It's just relentless. There was a headline in the Times earlier. There was a story in the Times earlier in the month about encryption, and it actually said, what is encryption and why is Mark Zuckerberg so keen on it? The messaging is just past the point of ridicule, frankly. The online safety bill, as it's been drafted, will make our private messages, such as the ones I'm sending to my daughter and the ones you're engaging with your friends and the ones you're engaging with your colleagues, subject to the duty of care on illegal content. And when I say illegal content in the online safety bill context, what I mean is terrorism and child sexual abuse material. So the code of practice on private messaging, in other words, the rules which providers of private messaging service have to follow, is likely to include the prohibition on end-to-end encryption to facilitate the scanning of our messages for terrorism and child sexual abuse content, because government thinks that we're all engaging in it. So you see what they're doing there. They're not going to prohibit end-to-end encryption per se. They're going to make it part of the compliance regulations, compliance requirements for private messaging, for end-to-end encryption to not be a thing. So yes, they'll be scanning our messages for the presence of the terrorist and the child abuse material, which government is convinced we're all trafficking in. But once the door is open to the scanning of our private messages, it is not outside the scope of reason to expect the duty of care to demand the scanning of our private messages for legal and subjective content, in addition to illegal content. So the messages we're engaging with our friends, our family, our colleagues, they may well be scanned too, because companies will have no choice but to do that if they want to remain within the law. And we know for a fact that some safety tech providers, supported and openly encouraged by government, are actually seeking to erode the privacy and computer misuse laws we have in the UK so that they can facilitate that sort of proactive content scanning and, as I mentioned, the modification of what we say. They're literally seeking to change what we say and make it nicer and less harmful. We also know that one conservative think tank has gone so far as to propose that the duty of care should be imposed to impose criminal charges retroactively onto developers who are currently using end-to-end encryption with no exceptions. If you're using end-to-end encryption for financial transaction security, they don't care. So it's really quite striking the extent to which there is a hard push in government and the media to both associate end-to-end encryption with child abuse and to criminalize not just its use, but to criminalize people listening to this webinar right now who are using it on your sites and services. So that is, and Robin's going to talk about encryption in depth, but that if there's any aspect of this bill we need to worry about, it's that. The second threat to the technical stack, which we feel that this bill presents, regards mandatory age and identity verification. This goes far beyond the issue of anonymity and whether you should have to register with a driver's license to have a Twitter account. Because the bill, as it has been drafted, requires companies in scope, that means yours, to assess whether it is possible for children to access your service, not to use it or to set up an account, just to access it. So if you're running a site or service which isn't explicitly a child service for children, you have to assess whether children are even looking at it. And companies like yours can only declare as a legal fact that children don't bother with your service if you can prove it. If you can prove that because you've been identifying and verifying your users, adults and children, through technical systems or processes such as age verification or age assurance. In other words, if you are not age gating your service to determine whether or not children access it, you will be in violation of the duty of care and the bill. So normally when I start talking about age verification with people, they jump right to what everyone thinks about, which is porn. Isn't this about adult explicit content? It's not. The past legacy debates on age verification, such as the debates about the Digital Economy Act, which is still rolling, concerned access to what we would all agree is, explicit adult content, and maybe the odd access to the local microbrewery. What we're seeing in the draft online safety bill is an expansion of age verification from adult material to all content and all interactions between all of us across all sites and all services, regardless of scope or proportionality, for anyone accessing any site or service. I've run over time. No, I know time's up, shut up. Regardless of any scope or proportionality for anyone accessing any site or service based in the UK. And the reason this is happening is because we're seeing some really aggressive lobbying from software service providers in the age verification field who want government to legislate in favor of their business model and are actually going so far as to expand the scope from age verification to identity and nationality verification. So for example, over the weekend, someone shared this, which is a copy of a document which MPs and parliamentarians received in one of their digital forums from the age verification providers. And this is what they're lobbying government and parliament to legislate in favor of, that to view universally appropriate content, you shouldn't have to verify yourself. To view age-sensitive content, which remember under the bill is completely subjective, you should have to verify your age. To share universally acceptable content, such as this webinar, you should have to verify your name, nationality. To share age restriction content, age, full name, and nationality, and to universal accessible interaction, to even talk with others. You should have to verify your age, name, and nationality. And if you're thinking, why in God's name does the Internet Society have to verify my nationality to be able to share this video with you? Well, what the providers will say is, well, we have to know what country you're from so we can apply the right law to you. But wouldn't Priti Patel love to have a database of the nationalities of everyone who accesses every service and every page and every site in this country? So that age verification, nationality verification, and identity verification, far beyond any proportionality involving harm or online abuse, is another direction that the bill is taking us in. And the third technical area that concerns us is the bill's scope for what are known as business disruption measures. These will be powers granted to Ofcom and the Secretary of State to, if they feel that a company, a site, or service is not complying with the online safety bill or the duty of care, they will be able to take enforcement action. And it's cascading in terms of scope and severity. They can issue a provisional notice of enforcement action for either illegal content, which means terrorism and CSAM, or for a company's inability to carry out one of the 25 subjective duties they will have. Remember those charts at the beginning on both illegal and legal content? So a failure to get any one of those right could trigger enforcement action. Those penalties are enforceable to a group of entities. There are penalties for failure to comply with a technology notice. If you're familiar with the Investigatory Powers Act, this is basically the content moderation version of a technical notice. It's an order for a company to, in this case, break encryption. Ofcom and the Secretary of State can issue a service restriction order to a provider of what's called an ancillary service to stop supporting a service. So for example, they won't cut off your site, but they'll tell your payment gateway to stop accepting payments. They'll tell your ad network to stop supporting you, which cuts off your ad revenue. They might even tell your host to stop hosting you. And the ultimate business disruption measure is what's called an access restriction order to block UK access to a site or service at the ISP network or app store level. So this is when government essentially shuts down a site by blocking people's ability to access it all, pulling it out of the app store, blocking it at ISP level. How would it work in practice? Well, Secretary of State will need to go through both Ofcom and the courts to issue a business disruption measure. However, there is a provision which you could expect in the bill, which will allow them to take action if it's a matter of what we can basically call national security or interest, in which case there's no process or advance warning that will be required. They can pull it. So the bill therefore contains the elements for government to use any number of issues or public concerns, encryption, who knows, as leverage to just block platform services and messaging apps from being able to be accessed or used in the UK, full stop. And no, they've never heard of a VPN either. So there is what we're facing, the British web for British people. Government has long said that the goal of the bill is to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online. But from the perspective of the Open Rights Group and the Internet Association, Internet Society, it is now clear beyond any doubt that this means a British splinternet. With the UK web and our access to it and our ability to use and publish and engage on it, subject to multiple levels of speech and behavioral monitoring, identity and age verification, and business disruption measures at the internet architecture level. Now, the responsibilities for all this, as well as the compliance costs, will be outsourced to you, your companies, or will be in the scope of the regulation, in addition to the fees you're going to pay to Ofcom as the regulator. You obviously pay a fee to the ICO as your data protection regulation fee. You're also going to be paying a fee to Ofcom as your online safety fee. Now, not only is government fine with all of these costs and all of these risks and all of this compliance obligations, they're also actually positioning this whole thing as a really lucrative business opportunity. for British technology to get on board this gravy train and start creating age verification and safety and content moderation and content interception services as a great post-British success story. So that's been your whistle-stop tour of what we feel are the technical risks of this bill. I know you probably came for some juicy gossip about what's actually happening in Whitehall with this bill. Well, we know that there's a pre-legislative scrutiny that's going to begin work on it this month, but it's going nowhere fast. We do know that the MPs who are going to be working on this bill, on that committee and outwards, take a very myopic view of this bill. They view this bill solely through the lens of, number one, social media. You know, to them, this is about 3 or 4 sites, full stop. What's more, they only view this bill through the lens of the horrific, sickening personal abuse and death threats they get nonstop towards themselves, their families, and their constituents. And everything I've just said to you, you cannot make any of those arguments to someone who's getting bombarded with death threats on social media every day. For a lot of them, as far as they're concerned, if this bill is going to stop that, they will vote for it. So that is the extent of the work we have ahead to help them understand these issues when all they want is the noise to stop. We do know, as I've just explained, that they're being very heavily lobbied by both corporate interest and by celebrities. Somebody said at work the other week, you would think this is the Stop Abuse Against Footballers bill for all the PFA we've been seeing about it. But we do know that there is an internal split across Whitehall between DCMS, who want a reasonable bill that will keep the UK a business-friendly place to start a new business, a new tech business, especially in the light of Brexit and the pandemic, versus the Home Office, who want the most hardcore restrictive bill that the drafters can come up with. We do know that there's a split across the Conservative Party, whereas some people see this as the very worst of personally intrusive, government-heavy regulation interfering with private life, whereas other areas of the Conservative Party are perfectly fine, and that's why the Conservative Party has drafted with this bill. The bottom line is this bill and these debates are going to run on and on and on and on and on, a bit like I've done too much now. So I will now turn it over back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. And I guess the good news in what we have, if there is any good news, is that we're actually attacking this quite early on, since this is a draft level. Maybe we should have attacked it earlier, but right now, thankfully, this is getting a lot of interest from a lot of places. So, hopefully, this pushback can have some impact. Now, we've had all of your presentation. Thank you so much for taking us through this. You have quite a lot of reading to do in the chat. There's been a lot of reaction going on. Next is Richard Allen, who has written an extensive blog post. So just before we go to Richard, I'd like to mention that your slide deck is already online. So if anybody wishes to have a look at it, it's on the ISOC UK, ISOC England website, and you can have a look at it from there and download it from there. Now over to Richard, who is no doubt going to provide us with further interesting facts about this and the consequences of this bill. And I can't quite see why I'm still smiling at the moment. It could be just out of being a bit nervous about all this. Richard.
Thanks so much, Olivier. And I won't go over the ground. I mean, Heather's obviously covered very effectively what the bill contains. And I'm really going to build off her final comment about this being a British splinter net, because I think that is the key impact that the legislation may have. I don't think intentionally, but I think that's where we could end up. So first, we shouldn't underestimate how significant a change this is. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for search and what they call user-to-user services, that's anything where there's interaction between individuals, it effectively moves them into a space that looks much like more like broadcast television or radio in terms of the regulatory framework. And just to pull out the data on the money, again, Heather referred to this, so the industry will be expected to pay, they estimate, around £46 million a year, which is a third of Ofcom's budget, and would allow Ofcom to employ, if you just sort of read the headcount across 200 or 300 people, many more than they have regulating all of the commercial television and BBC at the moment. So they're creating a framework within which there will be several hundred people, new people, sitting in a regulator in the United Kingdom, trying to enforce this regulation. And they've estimated that around again, this is their business impact assessment, lots of questions around it, but that around 24,000 different services would be affected. They even in their definitions, though, are creating a different kind of splinter net, which is they've tried to protect, for example, their friends in the traditional media and keep those excluded. They've tried to protect sort of regular websites that have commenting on them and trying to exclude them. So they're really zeroing in on this, say, search and user-to-user services, 24,000 or so of those who will be hoiking over £46 million a year to have 200 or 300 people overseeing them. Now, that is a really, really fundamental change from where we are today in terms of internet regulation. The government, I think, would argue that they've got popular support. And at one level, what they would see this as doing is moving their effect on online services from the informal to the formal. And by informal, I mean the kind of thing we've seen just this last week, where the Home Secretary bangs a table and goes, internet companies, you're the reason that refugees are crossing the channel, not because they're desperate people trying to escape, but because they've seen stuff on Facebook and Twitter. Internet companies, you must do something about this. And that's like the thing we see month in, month out. And I used to work at Facebook, and they come and bang on the table every week. And that's how they asserted control. So the regulation was done outside of any formal framework, but through this informal systems of pressure. And so at one level, the government will say, and I think it's important to understand their argumentation, that they are now making explicit this accountability that people have been calling for. They've said internet companies are unaccountable. Well, they're moving that from back channel conversations to a formal regulatory framework enacted by a regulator. So I think it's really important we understand that change. There's a question of, if we don't go down this route, we do have to ask the question of how comfortable we are with the other route, which has also attracted a lot of criticism of where governments around the world go in and exert pressure, as I say, through the back door. But I think the best way to sort of think of where this risk goes is to be conscious of how it works today. If I create a user-to-user internet service, I'm sitting here in London, and I build a website where people can interact with each other, and I plug in an internet connection. Immediately, by default, everybody in the world may decide to join my user-to-user service, and that's what I expect. And there's a few countries around the world where there's an existing regulatory framework, and China will probably shut me out because I'm not modifying the content. And Russians could get a bit uppity because they have a pretty robust existing regulatory framework where Roskomnadzor, their Ofcom, has a lot of powers actually to interfere with internet companies today. But by and large, my default is I'm thinking, well, it's global, and I'm certainly thinking that if we sort of use that term loosely, that sort of Western democracies, and actually much wider than that, that those countries are not going to put up any barriers to my entering their markets. What happens after this comes into force is I do the same thing, and I may get a letter from Ofcom if my service gets a bit popular. I think the very smallest companies will largely fly under the radar. But I start to get, a reasonable number of users. I get a letter from Ofcom, and it says, right, here's a list, and Heather showed us the list. Here's all the things you've got to do, and they're going to be quite expensive things to do. And here's the bill, by the way, that you've got to pay us so that we can check you've done the expensive things we've just told you to do. And again, because it's the UK, if I'm a UK business, I'll probably get on with it. There'll be some more cost. It is disproportionately more expensive for me as a smaller business than it is for the larger ones. But hey, I need to exist. And actually, if you're a non-UK service, there's a very good chance that you'll see the UK as a lucrative enough market that you'll want to stay in here. But we start to see this model spread, and this is where we get to the splinter net. I start my service from London. Now I get 30 demands from all different countries around the world who've adopted exactly the same legislation, all asking me to do very complicated things in multiple languages and pay money. And now I'm going to start to say, look, I'm just not going to go into those markets. And so what you'll see is a reduction of choice, both for the service provider and for the service user, as services have to be much more careful about which markets they want to enter. And they've shifted from this default global essentially to default local, and then thinking, look, how expensive is it going to be to meet the French version of the online safety bill, which inevitably will be different from the British one, different from the Colombian one, and different from the Indian one. How expensive is that going to be for me, and is it worth it? So we'll see this sort of significant change, I think, if this kind of legislation spreads. Having said all that, I think it is a really hard choice because there is popular support. for this kind of legislation. Heather referred to the very sort of specific issue of members of parliament, but certainly I think it's broader than that. And I think the government, would reasonably assess that the public at large, if simply offered the choice of, do you want companies to be unaccountable, or do you want a good British regulator to deal with them, they're actually going to say good British regulator. So there's a real issue around the choice question. And if they say, do you want this public accountability to be there, I think they'll get quite a lot of strong support for that. Against that, it's hard to get out the message to say, look, the price of that additional accountability, particularly if replicated in multiple countries, is going to be significantly less choice and a fundamentally different internet. One that's moved from global offers to geographically restricted offers. And I'd say within that, we should also be very conscious that the UK, US, there's a few markets around the world, will probably suffer the least in terms of the fact that people will still want to be in the market. There'll be other markets, I think, that would suffer really badly if they try to impose similar regulation, because people are just not going to go there. So with that, I'll stop. I hope that's a sense of where I think this will impact upon the market, but it doesn't provide an answer as to whether or not it's going to go ahead, because I think there is this challenge around popular support for it.
Thanks very much for this, Richard. Thanks for completing the overall grim picture that we have at the moment. Let's go now to the next person, and that's Robin Wilton from the Internet Society, and he's going to focus perhaps on the encryption side. I've also noticed there's quite some discussion in the chat as well going on. Over to you, Robin.
Yes, there is. So it's just a quick audio check. Is the sound okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Right,
Apart
okay.
from this bird chirping in the background, but that's fine. We like nature.
Yeah, sorry about that. I could set fire to the roof, but that's short of that. That's about okay, look, I will try and keep my remarks fairly brief, because I think most of the themes have generally been covered. But I want to talk about the bill's impact on encryption, the principle of necessity and proportionality, and the impact this bill is likely to have in terms of trust and economics. I mean, it may sound a bit weird to focus on the encryption aspects of this, because if you search the text of the bill on the word encrypt, you will only find it twice. The bill says virtually nothing about encryption. Sections 72 and 73 create an offence if you get an information notice from Ofcom and you respond to it by providing them with information that's encrypted, with the intent of making Ofcom unable to understand the content. And that's the only place it actually mentions encryption. But as Heather has, I think, very eloquently set out, the bill makes it far more probable that service providers will simply stop offering end-to-end encrypted services and products, because it increases the liability they face for the things that users do with those products and services. And I mean, the analogy I think of here is it's like going to the supermarkets and saying, you sell kitchen knives. We are going to make you liable for any knife crime committed with the knives that you sell. That wouldn't stop knife crime, but you'd go into the supermarkets the next day, there would be no kitchen knives on the shelves. They would simply disappear from the market. And I think there are real parallels here with what will happen to secure confidential communication services. Why does the bill not mention encryption? My personal view is I think the government knows that it cannot win the argument for backdoors. The last serious proposal the government made in support of the idea of backdoored encryption was GCHQ's proposal for so-called ghost listeners. In other words, to add a silent listener to encrypted conversations. And they said, we haven't touched the encryption, so this is perfectly okay. And rightly, I think that proposal was derided, and it seems to have disappeared. So I think the response from the government has been that if they can't win the argument for backdoors, they will simply impose obligations that make end-to-end encrypted services impractical or essentially eventually illegal. I guess the sort of defense one might get from an advocate of this bill is Yes, but this is just about end-to-end messaging, and as Richard said, it's about user-to-user contact. So this is very tightly scoped, and I would disagree. Our online lives depend on encryption, and more than that, in a world of connected things, if you don't have end-to-end encryption, it puts at risk your family, your home, your physical safety. And I'll give you a couple of examples why. Things like connected vehicles, where I've got an app on my mobile device with which I can, for example, unlock my car. Connected home security systems, again, an app on your mobile device through which you can either do things like unlock the front door via your smart doorbell, or you can monitor a video feed from CCTV from your house. Connected children's toys and things like cloud pets and the connected doll Kayla are absolute horror stories in this regard. Connected toys that basically allowed third parties access to the data that was being sent to a child's connected toy. All of those examples I've given depend on communication that has to pass legitimately through a third party. But if that third party is able to intercept and modify and potentially even forge the data going in one way or the instructions going in the other direction, all of those use cases put people at real physical risk. So imagine the consequence of a third party being able to send commands to your connected door lock or to tamper with the feed from your home security camera. Those are the things that are at risk if you don't have end-to-end encrypted technology. Then imagine similar vulnerabilities, and picking an example totally at random, those vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, such as, I don't know, the oil pipeline that provides the energy grid for a Northern Hemisphere continent. So what you get there is two future scenarios. One where you say, even in those life-threatening scenarios, end-to-end encryption is not allowed, or end-to-end encryption is allowed in those products and services, but at the same time, somehow it cannot be used for end-to-end encrypted communication services. And I don't think either of those scenarios is credible, either in terms of public safety or in terms of viable governance. Because if you tell me that this government would be capable of managing a system in which end-to-end encrypted communication was present in some products and services, but not in others, I'm afraid I wouldn't believe you. So necessity and proportionality. Legislation in this area, no matter this government's desire to move away from the European Union, must still satisfy criteria of necessity and proportionality, not least because it has a direct effect on citizens' fundamental rights. I won't dive into that in detail because the Open Rights Group is far better placed to comment on that than I am. But the rationale that you get given in terms of necessity is usually that law enforcement agencies simply can't access communication unless they've got technical access to the data, and therefore they can't do their job. William Barr, the AG in the US, and others refer to this as the going dark scenario. But then you look at law enforcement successes, and things like Silk Road and Alpha Bay and EncroChat, and very recently Anom, show that this just isn't the case. Network criminal activity creates vulnerabilities that law enforcement agencies can and do exploit. They can analyze communications metadata, location data, traffic patterns. That's business as usual. They can compromise the devices that criminals use. They can compromise the intermediary services that criminals use, such as the marketplaces, the messaging servers, and so on. And they can infiltrate or turn the network of people. That's the nature of networked criminal activity. It exposes itself to infiltration, to turning, to interference, and to compromise. Those are often far more actionable than the colossal volumes of communications content to which laws like this give law enforcement access. And at the IETF one year, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore put it very memorably. He said, if law enforcement agencies these days say they're blinded, it's not because of going dark, it's because they're staring at the sun. There is that much data they can't actually use sensibly and productively. So to round off, technically mediated communication may amplify some crimes like terrorism and child abuse, but it doesn't create them. The online harm bill is, and I call it that because that's what it does. I'm not going to buy into the vocabulary of online safety. I think that's just newspeak. It's silent on the causes and the origins of content that relates to terrorism, child abuse, other crimes. And yet it's put forward as the solution to what are at root societal problems. And that's an unrealistic claim. And this comes to Andrew's point in the chat about how tech companies aren't really pulling their weight. These are societal problems. And yes, the technology may amplify them, but the government's response here is to say that you can fix the problem by killing the amplifier, not by addressing the problem at root. This bill is framed in terms of the risk to adults and children from harmful content, but it says nothing about the risk of harm that comes from communications that aren't secure, or the loss of trust in services that can't commit to being secure anymore. Those risks affect everyone. And I'm minded of Robert Hannigan, the former director of GCHQ, his comment that it is not sensible to weaken the security of everyone in order to pursue a minority. So finally, I'd note that the impact assessment for this bill doesn't even attempt an assessment of the economic harm it will do, as Richard outlined. It makes a stab at a cost analysis. It says, we think it'll cost companies to read and understand the regulations, change their terms and conditions, meet the compliance costs of helping law enforcement, and then the operational costs of producing their risk assessments, content moderation, reporting. But we've published a report recently, which Olivier mentioned, analysing the Australian equivalent of this bill, the TOLA bill, that shows the economic impact of that is in the billions of Australian dollars. And the impact assessment for this bill just does not stack up as a serious piece of work when you compare it to that economic impact analysis. So I've probably run over too, I'm afraid, sorry about that. I'll just round off with a comment from a UK law firm. Observes that the bill is so radical and onerous in parts that if it survives the passage through the legislative system intact, the internet as we know it, and social media in particular, would be hard to recognise. And I think that is well put. I think this is a fundamental change that does harm that is not reflected in the policy statements or in the face of the bill.
Thanks very much for this, Robin. And I note that MR Lizer has already put his hand up. What I'm going to do is to continue with our last panelist in our list. And but I will, though, put something in the discussion here. There's, of course, a very healthy debate at the moment in the chat, but there's also a debate on the live stream with a couple of comments here. One from Rick Lane. Well, questions. From ISOC's perspective, should countries have the rights to protect their own citizens, or does that not apply to the internet? And another question from Neil Fairbrother. Children are raped using pay-per-view encrypted video channels. What is your solution for preventing this? Keep those in mind and put that for the discussion afterwards. And let's go over now to Chris Yapp, who's going to I guess close off the panel and take us to the debate, I guess.
Mute. Right. Can you now hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Right.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So it's wonderful to follow three really detailed, clear presentations. And I want to focus on two things. First is to look at some precedents. Where have we faced this before, and what are the lessons that we can learn from having been in this situation before? And I want to give you two examples. One is the transposition of the EU e-commerce directive into UK law, which was largely non-controversial at the time. I mean, it got cross-party support. There were many of the things that we all supported from that. And it had two really interesting factors that came out of it. One was that it meant that small companies in Britain could set up and trade across the whole of the single market and the customs union without having to set up in every single country. So you had what was called the country of origin rules. So what you were able to do was you could be the Cheshire Cheese Company or some other company or a Scottish fish company, and you could trade in Italy or wherever. And of course, that lowered the costs, and it meant that all of these small and medium companies that could not afford to set up in every other country were able to do so. At the same time, the downside of that was that it created the environment in which the tech giants, and we all know who they are, and I used to work for one, as did Richard, ended up paying very, very limited tax. So the problem was the unintended consequences are as important to watch as the intentionality of the bill. We faced a lot of examples. And as I said, this was not controversial legislation. Now, if I now look at a more controversial example from history, I would have to choose the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. And many of you will remember our old dear friend and colleague, Caspar Bowden. And I remember talking about the act, or the bill as it was, with him during its passage. And I wanted an example from him because I was speaking at a local government conference a few weeks later about the broad brush approach of RIPA. And I wanted to come up with an example that I could give them about how the vagueness of the legislative drafting could create crazy problems downstream. And the example I used was that the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act would enable a local authority to spy on parents to see if they lived in the area of a catchment area for a school. When I gave that as an example, as a keynote at a local government conference, it was laughed at. It happened less than 2 years later, right? So the point is, if you ask me, do we want to regulate online harms? Of course. Well, of course we all want to do it. We want to protect our children. We want to do it. But, and it's a big but, the problem is in these kind of environments, we need to be very, very careful. And one of the important lessons I learned from both RIPA and from the European is that you need to watch very, very clearly the powers for statutory instruments that are given to ministers. And what worries me within this bill, along with what Robin, Heather and Richard have said, is that the ministers have enormous power under the scope of this bill to introduce legislation on top of this. So where do I come from the historical example? The economic impact, as Robin suggested, is much, much bigger than the stupid arguments in the current draft. It is huge and it's there, but it gives too much power to the executive, and I do not like that. The second thing, from having worked for a long time in the industry, is now looking forward. And it's a debate I've started to get involved in with a number of people recently, which is we've tended to think about data, user-driven content, and published content as being three different things. And we can put a boundary around them and we know what we mean. But the problem is the developments in the technology blur and create problems that I don't think are understood by. And if you give power to the executive, could make this bill an awful lot worse than it is. So let me just give you an example. We all know, and Robin alluded to it, of examples where, for instance, people have put chatbots of apparently nice teenage girls on the internet that have been trained to become racist and sexist within 24 hours. And we've seen examples of this where you can do it. Now, let me imagine in 3 years' time, I develop a chatbot as a service which is a avatar-driven platform which enables people to hire or rent or buy an avatar, which will get to know me and personalize it. And so what I've got then is that a teenage girl finds a little avatar friend on a chatbot as a service example, and it discovers that she's very interested in self-harm. So it searches out material that is related to self-harm on the internet and starts feeding her lots of examples to support her interest in self-harm. Who is liable? The point is, we used to think of content was created by humans, data might be created by machines or whatever, and users. Here, the girl's own interest is creating or driving the creation of content from data with a machine learning based avatar from the content. Is the platform, where does the responsibility lie? And it seems to me that the difficulty is that, of course, I want to protect teenage girls. I mean, I've got granddaughters who are going into that age group. But the problem is that this kind of framework is anti-innovation, it's anti-technology. And the problem is, of course, that, again, going back to Robin's comments on the economic, it actually reinforces the power of the tech majors, because only they will have the resources to be able to invest in this area. It will not be possible for a small company to innovate in this space, because the costs of getting to break even and all the obligations they will have will absolutely eradicate any business model that doesn't support a monopoly. So those are my concerns. Historically, I think we have problems with this. We're giving too much power to the executive. We are facing it on the base models we have, not the way the models are evolving. And finally, that I think that the really big problem in this is that this is a draft. So many of the unintended consequences will come through the horse trading. Somebody will buy off some bit. There will be some other thing. I'm grateful that we've had it at this time, because I think we are early. But the problem is we probably need to do this every month through the whole passage of this bill, because we do not know where it is going to end up. And my worry is it's going to end up even worse than it is now. And I'm grateful to have the chance to respond to 3 brilliant opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Chris. And now we are opening the floor. And I know that before everyone, Dr. Mark Leiser had put his hand up and then put it down, and it's back up. So I wanted to give him the floor, and I understand that he's written a paper about this nearly a year ago. So over to you, Dr. Leiser.
Thank you, and thank you for all the presentations and speeches. They were very interesting. And as you indicated, I did write a paper on this, which I can make available if anybody wants to have a gander at it, that came out nearly a year ago now. It seems like time flies when you're having censorship fun. One of the things that strikes me and why I put my hand down was, I think Christopher Yapp nailed it. But I had this wonderfully worded question, and then Christopher started talking about REPA and e-commerce and kind of stole my thunder. And so I'm probably going to blunder through my question here. I think one of the risks here is that we get tied down talking about specific forms of technology like end-to-end encryption. And I'm really concerned that we focus on the technology rather than what the bill proposes as a political reality for developing online harms. So I'll give you a very quick example. Section 1.6 of REPA makes mention that a private communication service can escape criminal liability for intercepting communications if they do it in the form of transmission. So this is the legal basis that allows companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter to search and block and hash and report to the police child sexual abuse images. So the duty of care in reality is effectively only going to mandate that services use something like photo DNA to catch these types of harms. The problem with, and I really wish that we would focus a little bit more attention on this, is the the lack of the independence between government and the regulator. And so the paper, the proposals, we're all talking about this kind of tripartite regulatory relationship between off-web or off-com until off-web comes online, the Cabinet Office, which is the government, and the Joint Committee, which is the Parliament. And there's this tripartite relationship between the two. And the real problem here is not so much that we have end-to-end encryption, or I can understand why we have discussions about this, but it's the moving target of what amounts to an online harm. So the government can literally decide that something is an online harm and then mandate the duty of care to these companies to implement some sort of technological solution to block the things that they determine are harmful to us. And so I think Christopher made mention, it might have been Robin, I'm sorry if I got the speakers wrong, about Priti Patel and the TikTok story that came out over this weekend. You know, the idea that a story or a video on TikTok is going to glamorize asylum seekers and migrants coming to this country, and that could be in itself an online harm to users, and the government would then dictate that online harm as being something that social media, and I think that's the real danger that we need to focus on, because the technology is going to change. The online harm is a political mechanism to hold the technology to account, and the bill facilitates that. And I think that ties very nicely to Heather's comments about, you know, authoritarian regimes. If it's a moving target, it's a very dangerous road to go down, because these things get pushed under the radar very quickly as long as there's a legislative mechanism for government to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. We'll have Andrew Campling next, and then I'll ask our panelists if they have any comments or responses. And then we've also got some questions that I'll go through from the chat. Andrew, welcome.
Hi, thanks, Olivier. I'll try and be brief. I've got sort of two quick sort of point stroke questions. First one, which I sort of alluded to in the chat, is tech companies are actively lobbying against sort of legislation like the Online Harms Bill, but you know, let's be honest, it's happened over quite a considerable time. But they don't generally propose alternative solutions. So we know what the sector's against. It's not always clear, or it's rarely clear what they're for. Other than generating more revenue from their services. So I don't think that's helpful. And also, as part of that, I mean, certainly from where I engage with the sector, it feels to me like a lot of people in the sector are still living in the last decade, and they don't recognize that the perception of the sector has changed hugely. You know, since people discovered surveillance capitalism, you know, it's not accepted now that the internet is always universally a force for good. Yeah, I don't see that understanding really being accepted by the sector generally, dare I say it, by ISOC. And I think, you know, the approaches need to be modified to reflect the reality, not, you know, not the suggested reality of the last decade. And then just briefly, second point, because it's sort of various speakers sort of touched on the costs for small companies, which of course is true, and there needs to be proportionality here. But if you look at the legislation that the European Union is in the process of bringing in to remove terrorist content, if you look at the associated impact report with that, it quite clearly identified that the vast majority of the problem content in that context was hosted on small platforms. So you can't realistically expect that small companies can be exempt from compliance if in some of the more challenging areas like sort of terrorist content, they're generally the place where the problem's mainly occurring. It's not on the mainstream platforms for that type of content. And you know, look at the impact assessment for against that legislation for the detail, because I wouldn't pretend to have it. But I'm just deliberately trying to play devil's advocate, because you're all agreeing with each other. And I think it's not as simple as that. There are different points of view, and we need to accept that the world isn't as straightforward as the presentations have suggested. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this, Andrew. And I plead guilty, by the way, for having invited people with the same points of view. I guess it's just a follow-up from the fact that, you know, the Internet Society in itself has had a view in that. So we are admittedly biased, but this is where it's interesting to have this discussion here, and perhaps to even formulate the problem better and find some solutions. I think that Richard Allen wanted to had quite a few responses actually here. So Richard?
Yeah, I mean, just firstly to respond to Mark Leiss's point about Home Secretaries sort of mandating things. That is going to happen. And I think one of the really important questions with the bill is that it's based on a structure which assumes that Ofcom is an independent regulator, that every action the Home Secretary takes is governed by the Human Rights Act, and therefore they must certificate that it's necessary and proportionate, and that all of this can be challenged. And so yes, I'm 100% certain that if a legislation comes into force, Home Secretaries will try and issue ridiculous directives from time to time because they've got the power to do it. What I'm less sure about is whether they would get away with it or whether those would be struck down. And so again, one of the things we need to test as the legislation goes through is precisely how those mechanisms work, where if a British government decided to overstep the mark or issue guidance that was nonsense or tried to do things in a very partisan way, how confident can we be that Ofcom could say no? And or that a legal challenge to that guidance could be upheld. So just on Mark's point, just on Andrew's point, I just want to be really clear, big tech is not opposing this legislation. Don't expect to see them oppose this. They've become much more comfortable because they see this. I mean, some of the detail they'll have an issue with, but big tech largely now, and I know as there, largely sees this kind of legislation as A, inevitable, and B, something they can live with. And people will say, well, that's because, you know, they know it'll damage the smaller competitors. Well, it may be the case. I don't think that's a primary motivation. I think their primary motivation is they're just tired of always doing the wrong thing. And you're always doing the wrong thing when you're in a world where there's no fixed rules. And so they would just rather have a set of fixed rules and Ofcom regulating them than be left sort of holding the grenade or whatever it is that gets passed around on all the content issues. So I think big tech will be broadly supportive. I think I'm not far away from the position of thinking it's inevitable there will be some kind of framework, but it's the detail of the framework and the way in which it works which I think is critically important. And just again, finally on Andrew's points, small company exclusions don't make sense, blanket exclusion when you're talking about harms. You're absolutely right that it's not supported by the data. So there are issues around how small companies, the disproportionate effect of regulatory costs on small companies. But I, again, wouldn't support, you know, these blanket exclusions, which some legislation does, where it just kind of goes, you know, if you're small, it's nothing to do with you. If you're really legislating to prevent harm, you've got to look at the whole sector, but then sort of calibrate how the responsibilities work in response to that.
Thanks, Richard. And next is Robin Wilton.
Oh, thank you. I had unmuted and wondered if she was going to come in. But so, yeah, okay. But let me just sort of give my perspective on one of Andrew's comments, which is about tech really not putting its work, not bringing solutions to the table. I've been at the Internet Society for my 9-year anniversary this week. And before that, I was in the tech industry since 1985. I worked at IBM's Sun Microsystems, Gartner Group, and elsewhere. And certainly from the 2000s onwards, a major part of my work has been to do with online privacy. Under the previous Labour government, Sun Microsystems, among other things, successfully represented that the government's ideas for a national identity register were unworkable and dangerous in privacy terms. And I think that was a beneficial outcome, that those plans were shelved, and that when the subsequent government was elected in 2010, part of their manifesto was to, quote, roll back the database state. Now, I mean, clearly we've moved on since then and we are in the database state, but at least that was the commitment they had to put into their manifesto. For the last 9 years, it has been a fundamental principle of the Internet Society that we must achieve two things. We must improve people's ability to access the internet, and given access, they must be able to trust the things that they find online. And we've been doing as much as we can to make that happen, to find practical ways of making it happen. So yes, there are aspects of the tech industry that are in this for the money. They are commercial organizations, why wouldn't they? But I don't think it's all on one side either. I think there are people in the so-called child safety software lobby who are riding this one for all it's worth and see a great alignment, tactical alignment between what the government wants and the growth of their own market. So I take Andrew's point, but I think it is very much a double-edged sword. And my approach to it is to define and stick to principles.
Thanks, Robin. Next is Heather Burns.
Yeah, I just wanted to address one of Andrew's points, because I realized that my talk was very much like, here's the problems. We do have positions which we want to see put forward as the solutions. And one of the solutions, the policy solutions we want to see to deal with the issues that are raised in the online safety bill is interoperability and competition and diversity. There should be more options to choose from. If we don't like this concentration of power amongst the big tech companies, we should have more social media companies, more platforms to choose from. So we need to make it easier to start up those competitors, those aspirants. One of the key roles of tech policy, as you know, is if you regulate the internet as if only Facebook and Twitter exist, the result will be that only Facebook and Twitter exist. And what we've got now is a piece of draft legislation very much geared towards those big tech companies, which imposes really high barriers to entry for any aspirant or startup. Now, there's actually a part in the draft which prevents a foreign company from starting up in the UK until they have done all those risk assessments that I discussed in those slides. And, I don't know how any company is supposed to prove that they're meeting certain thresholds for their users when they don't have users yet. It becomes a massive paperwork exercise they have to do. So we should all be pushing towards interoperability, competition policy, more markets, more companies to build a healthier marketplace rather than this concentration. And I feel that the bill's drafters have completely missed that out, that they're creating such a regulatory burden, barrier to entry, that who's going to want to do any of this, much less, and we haven't even got to the point where one of the obligations they'll have to have is establish a staff member who is the person who could literally have criminal charges put against them personally, not the company, personally, if they get one of those subjective duties of care wrong. Would you start up a business here? I don't think so. So I think that government has some thinking to do about the message that this draft bill is sending to aspirants, to startups, to people who might want to create a more healthier atmosphere of social media and platform diversity, that you're just creating a no-go zone, that you would have to be crazy to start up a business here.
Thank you, Heather. There was actually a question in the live stream chat from Neil Frebrother. Would it help from a safety perspective if social media companies were classified as publishers?
So that's getting into the whole platform or publisher debate, which is a very American one. And I think we do need to give some thought to the fact that certainly the push I have seen working in policy is anything that came from the EU gets thrown out as the baby with the bathwater. So we've talked about getting rid of the e-commerce directive, and this was also spoken about as well. But is this the replacement? And are we just getting rid of that for the terrorism and the child abuse content? Or are we expanding that to everything? We actually haven't dealt with that question yet, and nobody has. So we need to need to make a decision here. What are we doing with the prohibition on general monitoring obligation? We sort of half answered as sort of platforms or publishers, but we haven't really dealt with it in depth.
Okay, thanks for this. I'm not seeing any other hands up. I'm a bit surprised that we have so few people queuing up. We still have about 15, well, a bit less now, probably 10 minutes. And I know that we had put some time, allocated some time for the, the next steps, but I think that we're already touching on some of the next steps here as to what needs to happen. I was going to ask Robin regarding what's going on with this letter that is going to be published in a few days' time, if I understand correctly, and that was co-signed by a quite a large number of organizations, and see what's the next steps on that to start with.
So was that a heavy sigh from Christian? I think,
that was a sigh from Christian.
I'll try and drag that out of storage, because it's not top of mind at the moment. My short-term memory is completely shot. But I did want to pick up on Doc's question, which I thought was a really good one, and I see Richard's given an initial answer in the chat. Doc's question was, do we feel that the individuals who contribute to the content of the bill really have any understanding of the technology and the broad issues, or are they simply carrying the banner of a small aspect of the problems the bill is supposed to address? I don't know who the drafters were, but reading some of the provisions, it's clear to me that they have had very detailed, technically informed advice from the kinds of organization who would put this stuff into effect. And I'm thinking large telcos who already have a close relationship with the security services, security and intelligence services, law enforcement, and so on. There's a lot in the phrasing of the description of the capabilities that you would only get in the bill if you'd been briefed by someone who has had to put this, who knew what you needed to ask for. That said, I don't think that's been the determining factor in shaping the bill. I think the determining factor has been that the people proposing the bill, as opposed to people actually writing it, see an opportunistic short-term alignment between a resonant public message about child protection and an unstated objective of, as Heather outlined, achieving a far greater degree of control by using those technical levers, technical and economic levers. And I think that's one of the that's one of the most disturbing aspects of this bill, is the disconnect between its stated objectives, its achievable objectives, its likely outcomes and side effects, and the interest groups who are actually proposing it because they see it as meeting their own interests too. And I find that frankly disturbing. And I think it's a symptom of a lack of healthy public consideration of what the issues actually are.
Thanks for this, Robin. We've got two people in the queue, and I think that Richard also wanted to just comment quickly on Doc's points.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that the civil servants have been working on it for a number of years, and they are, I believe, very good. We need to be really careful, because I always find it's not helpful to criticize civil servants who may have put something into a bill because of political pressure, and they're often sort of triangulating. And some of the worst stuff, things like Heather touched on, things like, a child verification provider is going to come along and go, I could just fix all the child verification, it's really easy. They're going to pitch that to a politician, and the politician's going to tell the civil servant to write it in. I think if they went straight to the civil servant, they would get a much frostier reception, because the civil servant would be much more likely to kind of call BS on them for things like that. So as the bill goes through, one of the key tensions is going to be politicians being lobbied, and then sort of getting civil servants to write stuff into the bill that the civil servants know themselves is not great. But they can't say no, because they know who the bosses are in this dynamic. So if you're going to be very involved, and we're going to campaign around it. I think civil servants are more likely to be friends on a lot of issues, and it may well be the politicians who are our sort of shared enemy, because they're reacting very much to like stuff that's in the headlines and these ideas, all these quick fixes, which always seem super attractive if you're in the political world. I say that as a politician.
Thanks, Richard. Colin Hayhurst.
Thanks very much. Yes, I did put the question in the chat, so I apologise if I'm repeating one which didn't want to pick up on. But we're in search, so we're particularly interested in that. I think there's I've read through the whole 500 pages of all the stuff and seen the comments and stuff, and it seems to be, probably understandably and probably justifiably more concentrated on user-to-user services. Not so much on search, but the particular question I had was that if I've read it right, user-to-user services is going to be put into two category levels, whereas search is only one category level. And I just wondered if anybody knew why that was, and did they think that was a good idea or not?
Richard?
Yeah, so that's a nod to this idea that bigger companies have more responsibility. So if you look, they went and looked at this German legislation called the Network Enforcement Act. If anyone can say it in German on the call, I'd love to hear. It's a very long word, and that sort of has a cutoff point. That does this sort of, if you're very big, you're in scope. If you're small, you're out of scope. They, I think, decided not to follow exactly that model, but the two-tier thing reflects the fact that there will be additional responsibilities on the larger companies, and those additional responsibilities mainly focus around dealing with this harmful but not illegal content. So basically, if you're a small company, your feet are going to be held to the fire to deal with illegal. If you're a user-to-user, if you're a bigger one, you'll have these additional responsibilities around harmful.
Can I come back on that, because I understand that's not the case for search?
No, not for search. No. So that's on the user, and I think they're just assuming that all search companies are big, maybe.
Yeah, well, we aren't, and we're a UK search engine, so it's quite ironic.
It may be a thing worth raising, because I think that probably is just their assumption that
fair enough.
Index the whole web, and if and they have actually tried to exclude a bunch of more specialist search services. But one of the big open questions: how far a smaller search service? I was thinking things like vertical shopping services and things. In or out of scope, I think is again one of the key questions to ask now.
Okay, thanks very much. That makes kind of what I expected, but it's good to hear that. Thanks.
Thanks for your question, Colin. Next is Alex McDonald, and I'm a little concerned of the time, but we did start a few minutes late, so we'll probably run over a little bit. Alex McDonald.
Just a quick 3 observations. First of all, I'd like to thank people for such an interesting chat today. I came late to this, but thank you. Found it on Twitter. Well done, Twitter, for all their other ills. The observation I'd like to make, first of all, Andrew's contention that the tech companies are not doing enough. The problem we have with tech companies, I come from a tech background, I've worked 40 years in the industry with American companies. A lot of the service providers are building their infrastructure out of parts. They don't have any control over the parts. Those parts are often supplied, mainly supplied, in fact, by other third parties who have other interests in providing good, secure, and sound technology. That necessarily makes it quite difficult for service providers to actually determine how, for instance, to enable encryption. If all the parts you've got of encryption turned on by default, then it's blinking difficult turning it off. The second observation is that the GDPR, I had involvement with the GDPR way back with the storage industry when we were trying to convince Europe that deleting data wasn't a really good idea. Deleting keys was, and that meant encrypting the data. And once you'd encrypted it, if you threw away the key, all copies of it, regardless of where they are or what they are, were effectively destroyed without actually having to delete them. And the third observation would be that good compression, as I know, because that's one of my areas of specialization, is actually indistinguishable from encryption. And you've got a real problem in differentiating between the two on modern systems.
Thanks for this, Alex.
Well, except that hopefully the encryption is reversible.
Well, compression is reversible too. That's the whole point.
Sorry, I was thinking of hashing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll finish off then with Andrew Campling.
Thanks, Olivier. I thought came up with another question when you said there weren't any other questions, and then two other people jumped on as well. But sorry for being greedy. Two very quick points. One was, I think there's a general perception that people sort of talk about save the children and you get the proverbial eye roll, either sort of metaphorically or in many cases literally when that comes up. I think it's just worth saying that I'd apply the same comment to save the dissidents in this discussion, that they're both bandied around as reasons to justify various actions, and I think neither of them by themselves are equally valid. Because, for example, the implication of we should do stuff to protect the dissidents that might make it hard to stop child sex abuse material, for example, that the implication of that is, so we have to wait till North Korea reforms before we can do something to protect children in our country. So I'm just using that as a for example to say I don't think either argument by themselves flies, and we collectively need to try harder intellectually to justify a position than either save the children or save the dissident. And then just very briefly to respond to a question in the chat, I was asked for example of where sort of tech standards are developing that are bypassing existing protections, and one that occurs to me was at the moment if you combine encrypted DNS, which is an existing standard, specifically DOE, with encrypted client hello, which is currently in development in the IETF. Between those two, I'm told by people in the education sector that they will completely bypass the mandatory school content filtering that is deliberately placed on it as a legislative requirement on schools in England to ensure that school children can't access illegal content. So that's a current example of two current or very recent standards that have, admittedly as an unintended consequence, real world implications in terms of potential for exposure to harmful content. So that was useful to just throw that in for good measure. Thank you.
Thanks for all this, Andrew. Very, very helpful. There was one more question which I found in the chat, which was maybe, well, it was actually a suggestion. Could the fines raised and paid to Ofcom go into a pool to help smaller companies fund safety tech? We had quite a few questions that were still unanswered in today's call. So if anybody wishes to address this in their closing remarks, but just before that, we'll have Jen Person, and then afterwards, we'll go through our panelists for closing remarks. Jen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Olivier. Just to come back to Andrew's point and to clarify for everyone on the call, as I've been researching this sector in schools for many years now, there is no legislative requirement for the use of safety tech in British schools. There is a requirement for appropriate monitoring, and that can be human. It does not have to be technology based. So just to make sure that that's a very clear position in case it should mislead anyone by mistake, because it's very commonly misunderstood and is very commonly actually misstated in safety tech's own marketing. And also just to clarify, I think it's important that we don't lose sight when we're looking at the detail of this, which has been exemplary in, thank you to all the panelists today, that there are fundamental human rights questions here that apply to children as well. And I get frustrated when I hear, think of the children as the arguments as somehow versus the dissidents question. This is a very significant point in time for children as bearers of human rights to make sure that the rule of law is upheld that supports them as well as everybody else. And it worries me greatly that at COGEX, the launch of Safety Tech last March, one of the leading UK safety tech providers, CEOs, and I believe one of their team may even be on this call, came out and said their legal team, their lawyers had told them, and he publicly stated this at the launch of the Safety Tech event, their lawyers had told them their tech was unlawful because they were intercepting incoming communications. Now, if we have tech providers who are content to breach the law and then do not self-report that breach of law, and then are equally encouraging new legislation to make that unlawful practice lawful, We are in a very risky position. And I think as human rights defenders and as tech industry and as industry bodies, we are at a critical time to make sure we work together to uphold the rule of law, the rule of democracy, and human rights as a fundamental position that actually underpins the importance of what the internet provides to the world today. And I think we really need to make sure we champion that and not lose sight of the rule of law in this whole debate as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. Let's go quickly then through our panelists for their closing remarks. Heather Burns.
I'm going to close by telling a story, and I know some of you on this call have heard this story from the person directly, but there's somebody we work with in the freedom of expression groups who is a former MP. And as an MP, she was on the receiving end of the most horrific abuse and death threats imaginable, nonstop, incessantly. They still trickle in to this day, even though she's no longer an MP. And a couple of weeks ago, she informed us that the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, has confirmed a viable death threat, which was issued to her, that they felt they needed to act on. Now, the thing was that death threat happened in December 2019. She reported the threat to the platform it came in on. They did everything they were supposed to do. But once it was handed over to law enforcement, it took them 18 months to validate a viable death threat. And to me, that little anecdote is our nine harms issue in a nutshell. We're talking a lot about big tech and social media and platforms and responsibility. But in a case like that, that's a perfect example of how the platform did everything they could. What about the law enforcement, the social safety net? Because we've all lived through the past decade of austerity. We all know what's happened to police, public services, community health. We've lost our social safety net. And I really worry that we're expecting this bill to charge service providers, whether that's big tech or small business, with the job of being the social safety net, when, as we've just seen from that example, they can do everything they can. They are not law enforcement, they're not police, they're not the courts, they're not the prison service. And we need to get this conversation from, we need to steer it away from big tech and social media and big evil tech giants to what sort of society do we actually want to be, and whose responsibility should that society lie with?
Thank you, Heather. Next is Richard Allen.
I'd actually just follow on from that. I think the reason this is hard is because it is an area where you're having to trade off different fundamental rights against each other: privacy, freedom of expression, the right to safety, security, etc. All of those things you end up inevitably having to trade off against each other when you're debating online activity. And then the question is sort of who makes that decision, and is that a sort of whole society decision that's been accepted? So I think we need to, I agree entirely with Heather, we need to have that debate. You could end up with a position where British society decides that swearing online is so sufficiently harmful that we don't want to allow it. That would be acceptable if it's acceptable if it kind of passes muster under human rights legislation and Article 10 and all of that, and government wants to advance and the popular support is there for it. Or you could end up with a situation where you're incredibly permissive and much more the kind of First Amendment end of the spectrum. I think the critical thing is that decision about where we are on the spectrum, when it's reasonable to ask for ID, when you want to speak, all these questions are debated in public, established in a public forum, and then everyone, police forces, government, tech companies, all sign up to that commonly agreed set of standards. And that's where I'd love us to get to. The bill, I think, creates a forum, at least in which we can debate that. It may not provide the solutions, but it provides a jumping off point for us to have that discussion.
Robin Wilton.
There's a trick that I use when I'm trying to analyze a problem like this, which, as Richard says, is a matter of balancing so many different things. It's what Honora O'Neill, the philosopher, calls an incomplete predicate. And that's what we've got in the government's description of this bill. They say that the aim of this bill is to make the UK the safest place online. And the incomplete predicate there is the word safe. Safe from what? And it's not until you complete the predicate that you start to unfold the different dimensions of the problem. And what we've got at the moment is a constrained public debate because the predicate has been completed for us. It is to make children in the UK safe from paedophiles. And as long as we keep the predicate that tightly scoped, we will end up with a broad brush solution that actually does not suit the interests of the vast majority of stakeholders, including children. So the key to this is to complete the predicate, explain what it is that this is expected to keep us safe from and how, and then to see what role technology plays in that, as opposed to the roles of things like awareness raising, education, social norms, and the factors that actually are inconveniently long-term for most of our current politicians, but are the keys to achieving sustainable behavioral change. You don't achieve sustainable behavioral change by interfering at one point in the decision cycle with a technical fix. And that's the blinkers that this bill is drafted with.
Chris, Yapp.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank my fellow panelists. It's been a fascinating conversation. And I want to particularly pick up on Heather's point, because she's the only person who's made it, which is that the solution has to be pro-competition. I think that's really, really important. And I think going forward, I think we need to think about solutions that enable a more viable, dynamic and changing thing to cope with changes in society's values, changing the way we do it. The point I want to make to final is just my experience, not just in this technology, but my wife is a doctor, and I often get involved in legislation in medicine. And the problem is there's only roughly space in the legislative framework once every 10 years to put something like this through. And the interesting thing is to try and think, okay, so if this act goes through a second change in 2031, 2032, what's the kind of environment that we might be in technologically? And what is the damage that this legislation might create in terms of being anti-competition, in terms of being anti-innovation, in being anti? And the problem that I have is that, let me just give you one example, just to illustrate this area. The emergence of technology like GPT-3, the machine learning system that can now write essays that can pass college entrance in the United States, is that we have really interesting problems about this distinction as to content that is not defined or made by humans. By 2030, we're going to be in a very different world in terms of content. And I worry that the kind of framework that we have here will probably not be viable within 3 to 4 years. And we will not have a chance to replace this legislation for 10. So for me, I want two things to go forward from my viewpoint and would want to be involved in. One is what's pro-competition. And that is the second one is how do we stop the unintended consequences of this happening, which is that we will not be able to reform this framework on the timescale that the technologies are developing. So those are my final remarks.
Thank you very much for this, Chris. And clearly there's a lot still going on in the chat. I wanted to thank especially Tara Taubman-Basarian, who's been very active on there with a lot of interaction. There's also some chatting going on the live stream, and some comments made about allowing the tech lobby, private NGOs to develop policy by code instead of policy by elected officials. Clearly, I think there's still a lot more debate to be had on this. We're at the very beginning, I guess, of this debate. We'll be seeing what we can do next. Perhaps a regular call. I think that's been mentioned a bit earlier. I'm not sure about every month, but we'll have to discuss this and see if there is interest for that. But I wanted to absolutely thank all of our panelists today and everyone who has contributed to this call. It's been fascinating from my angle, from my perspective, and I'm sure a lot of people I've seen also saying that this was really interesting for them. The follow-ups first follow-up, I guess, is the recording, and the recording will be on the ISOC UK website. I've put the link in the chat. isoc-e.org if you haven't got access to the chat. And we'll put it up within the next couple of days, see how quickly we can put the recording up there. And then we'll follow up, I'm sure, with some future events on that. If you're not a member of the Internet Society, it's free membership. I think you go to isoc.org, click on membership, and of course you have to go for the chapter membership as well, so that you're kept in touch with what's going on in the UK chapter. And I think that's it, really. Enough time. You probably all have other more important things to do now. So thanks again, and see you on the internet in the future, wherever you are, actually, because I notice people from all around the world. So have a very good morning, afternoon, evening, or night.
Thank you so much for organizing this. We all really enjoyed it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.